a yogi, an author, a YouTube personality, a blogger, a poet, an expressive arts therapist, a recovery ambassador, a figure skating enthusiast, a stepmom, dog and cat mom, and an overall cool person. You can find her online at drjamiemarich.com, mindfulohio.com, and by searching her hashtag Redefine Therapy on social media. But for the next half hour or so, we have her here in the flesh. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Jamie Marich.
Thank you, Jack, for that amazing introduction. So welcome everybody to Stamp Out Stigma. I'm just so glad that this event is happening because I want to share with you a few stories from the last year or so that proved to me as a public figure, as a clinician, as an author, as somebody who does this for a living, why we need programs like Stamp Out Stigma and why we need awareness to even reduce stigma. So a little over a year ago, I was at the wedding of two of my very good friends. And to make a very long story short, I figured it would be a pretty open-minded crowd because it was the first same-sex wedding I had attended in the state of Ohio. And I was very glad to be there. And I was seated at a table with some of my friends' family members, and they introduced me as, oh, this is Dr. Jamie Marich, and she works very closely with our mother, and she's written books and all of this. And as the dinner conversation progresses, at a certain point, overdose came up and the opiate epidemic. And one of my companions at the dinner table said, this is just such an unnecessary waste of money on Narcan and treatment, we should just let them die. And I sit there obviously enraged and broiling inside, and my guest who was at the wedding with me kind of had a sense of, Jamie, calm down, you're at a wedding, don't embarrass your friends because it's their day and everything. And I let the conversation proceed, and there was a nurse at the table, there were some other individuals at the table who were debating the whole opiate epidemic thing. And, you know, is it choice, is it this, is it that? And I'm sitting there obviously very uncomfortably. And the nurse at the table looked over at me and she said, I'm sorry, is this conversation a little too heavy for a wedding? And I said, no, I'm just very upset right now because I'm an addict who's 15 years in recovery. And the people you're talking about could have very easily been me. And this is why there's a problem. Because so much of why use continues and so much of why mental health continues is because of the way that people can make us feel when it comes to getting treatment, when it comes to getting help. And it was just not cool with me, and I let that be known. And then as soon as I outed myself, it was of course, we're sorry, we had no idea, and this, that, and the other. And I said, hey, you know, this is what we're dealing with. That there are people like me. I now have over 16 years in long-term recovery from drugs and alcohol, and it has been a long and winding road to get here. So I think the focus of what I'd like to share with you a little about today is a little bit of my story. Because I do speak all over the world on professional topics. I'm a trainer in several advanced level methods for trauma. I speak on addiction, I speak on mindfulness, I speak on yoga. But I think some of the most sacred work I'm asked to do is when it comes to speaking about my own story and my own recovery. Because one of the biggest messages I want to give is that recovery is possible. And this is coming from somebody who first contemplated suicide at the age of 9. I have a very vivid memory of opening a drawer and seeing a knife. And as a response to bullying, as a response to some family trauma dynamics, which included a lot of shaming and persecution in the sake of religion, for the sake of religion, I just developed a very dark sense of, I am not safe in this world. And one of the things I hear out there that really upsets me more than anything, and I may be preaching to the choir in this room, is when I hear comments like, you know, kids are resilient. Kids can't get things like PTSD. That, yeah, a lot of kids grow up in bad environments, but kids will break out of it. And there was honestly several years of my life where I didn't think I would. and asking for help because of some of the dynamics in which I was raised. It was interesting how Fern talked about these statements like, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, or you just need to pray about it, which was another thing that I had heard over and over again. And that if you're still struggling, it must be because you're not praying hard enough. And trust me, if any of that would have worked, I would have done it. Because I was this little precocious, overachieving, creative child. And I was still in a very, very, very dark place. And I think a big part of talking about stamping out stigma and ending the stigma around addiction recovery and mental health recovery is to also talk about the reality of suicide. And how for so many of us who have survived these ideations and these attempts, it really is a matter of being a survivor. And I think of that. I've had so much suicide in my life. People, friends, family members who've died by suicide. And I'm grateful every day that I've been, even as I say that, it's hard to know why I've made it and others have not. And so I honor them. And I thank them, those who have died by suicide, for teaching me what it is that I may need to do to better take care of myself, because this is an everyday struggle. It can be an everyday struggle. And even though I have been in some form of active recovery for the better part of 17 years, a reality about recovery from addiction, from mental illness, is just like many other chronic physical conditions, there's often not an instant cure. That yes, for many of the things that we struggle with, treatment can help and can really cause a very, very big shift. But another reality out there is that life continues to happen. And life is a bit of this traumatic journey that can be laden with suffering. That if you are a very sensitive individual, and I don't say sensitive as an insult, when I tell people that they're sensitive emotionally, it's one of the best compliments I can give. Because I believe it's those of us who are sensitive and feeling and in tune who have the ability to really change the world through our ability to reach out and help others with compassion. So I say honestly that just about every day from the ages of 9 to 25, I had thoughts of suicide. And that was even a couple years into my own addiction recovery. A lot of my active drug and alcohol use I consider to be one long suicide attempt. And for some reason, the higher power, the inner power I choose to call God, saw it fit to bring people into my life who were able to give me the ropes to pull me out. So I want to share a little bit about how I got help, because it's a bit of a weird story. I do very much wish, or maybe not, because I wouldn't have been here if I would have taken this path, that I would have had access to some of this help in an easier way. But it took me a lot of traveling and a lot of following my intuition to be able to get the resources I needed to heal. I do want to shout out Tony in campus counseling, because the first counselor I ever saw of any kind was when I was an undergraduate student at Youngstown State. And even there, walking into campus counseling, it was, what would my mother say? What would my family say about going to see a head shrink? And this was in the 90s, and that was still a big part of my thinking. And even though I was pretty raw at that time, my 19-year-old year was a very tricky year with my drinking really escalating, kind of coming to terms with no longer being in my parents' house and realizing that I had a lot of freedom, but not being sure what to do with that. And I just had all of this sensitivity that I had no idea how to manage. So my official diagnoses, I've been treated long-term with what is called dysthymia. Traditionally, it has a new name now, the DSM, kind of the low-grade chronic depression. We often call it the allergies of depression. And then a little later in my addiction journey, I was diagnosed with unspecified dissociative disorder, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means here in a minute. But getting sober was really the first priority. And I will say that having that counseling at the campus was a lifeline. It was definitely a lifeline, just to have things validated. And any of you in here who have been on any kind of mental health or recovery journey, I just think there's so much power to having somebody tell you something like, you're not crazy, you're not psycho. This is actually a very normal response to a lot of stressors that are happening in life. And for many of us, it is an absence of coping. Because I think so often kids are just thrown into life, and it's kind of this sense of figure it out, or just do what I do. And we're not taught how to manage this intense emotions and this intense trauma that can happen in life. So let me speak a little bit about trauma, because that is my primary clinical specialty. Trauma just means wound, because I think too often we think trauma and we think PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. We think veterans, and all of that can very much be true when it comes to trauma. But this really changed my world when I realized that trauma just means wound. And think of what you know about physical wounds and how they heal. There's so many nurses in the room, and they could probably speak to this better than I can, about how true healing of a wound needs to happen from the inside out. That we often need to stabilize it from the outside in, but that true healing has to happen from the inside out. Wounds can take a very short time to cause and a very long time to heal. Wounds can leave scars that, if we have physical vulnerabilities, can take a long time to clean up. And all of these parallels apply, physical to emotional. Any emotional, spiritual, verbal wound needs to heal from the inside out, needs to be validated, requires treatment. And that is regardless of the severity of that particular wounds. That wounds need care. And sometimes that care comes in the form of simple validation and being given the time and the space to heal it. And so often, survivors of both physical traumas and emotional traumas just aren't given that. Just aren't given that. And all of these parallels, physical to emotional, ought to make sense. But I think what can make emotional, spiritual, verbal wounding even more pervasive is that there is often a lack of a physical sign that I am wounded, that I'm hurting. And a lot of this was already spoken to at the podium. That with physical injury, with physical illnesses, as a culture, we tend to feel sorry for that, or at least have empathy for that, more than a lot of these unseen wounds, which can be incredibly more pervasive. And then when there's tragedies like overdoses and like suicides, we wonder why. And that healing goes way back before, that needs to happen way back before. That what we see with suicide, with overdose, is really just an end result of a lot of unhealed wounds. One of my very good friends and collaborators out in LA, Dr. Steve, will say, we don't have an opiate epidemic right now. We have a trauma epidemic that people take opiates for. Just consider that for a moment. Do we have a suicide epidemic, or is it a trauma, a wounding epidemic that just remains unaddressed? So I had to take some very drastic measures to self-preserve, if you will. So after my college experience, I was stuck in a rut in this period of suicidal usage. Didn't feel I can go for help to my primary family, because when I tried, I was shut down in many ways. So I did what any sane person would do, and I moved to Europe. And I say sane now because it was that moment of sanity and that moment of clarity I was given. So my last name is Marich, we would say in Croatian. My family's from Croatia and Bosnia originally, and I went there after the war. There was a very brutal civil war, just a quick brush up on current events, from 91 to 95. And the weirdness of all of this was I had to go to a war zone to get help. That I had to go and work in a post-war environment to be taken to the health and healing that I needed. And now I see it as some kind of divine spiritual pull that took me there. But at the time it was, let me just get 8,000 miles away from all these people who are causing all this grief and stress in my life. And I had the good fortune of being able to work for a Catholic parish when I was there that was very active in providing aid and outreach. And it was being able to serve as an English teacher at the time, an English teacher, a music teacher, children who had survived this brutal civil war and this brutal post-communism transition. And those students were my teachers. They taught me so much about the power of resilience, about triumph of the human spirit, and I just became very, very interested in learning about them and their stories. And it was connecting on that level that helped me to get some of the initial healing that I first needed. So I went to Bosnia. I had stopped using drugs, but I continued to drink. And I had the good fortune of meeting a woman who is no longer with us named Janet Leff. And her being there saved my life. If you know anything about 12-step programs, the 12th step is continue to carry the message to others who are still suffering. And Janet working her 12th step is why I'm here today. So she was getting started. This was 2001. So not too long after the war, not too long after her own retirement. And she was sent to Bosnia to help with treatment, getting some initial treatment centers started. Because if you think things are bare bones here in some communities, in Bosnia in 2001, it was practically non-existent. And there was still a lot of antiquated beliefs, such as, well, you know, you have to be dead and lying in a gutter somewhere to truly be an alcoholic. And one of my favorite ones I was told is, women can't really be alcoholics, which at one point when I went out drinking one night and one of my Bosnian friends called me an alcoholic, I knew I must have been bad, because this was so much of the pervading wisdom that women can't be alcoholics. And my very first exposure to anything recovery related was I went to a meeting with Janet to translate for her. It was not a 12-step meeting, it was more of like a regional council type meeting. She didn't speak any Croatian. I spoke enough to be able to translate for her. Her interpreter wasn't available that day. And as I was sitting there listening to others talk about alcoholism and addiction, I was filled with this sense of, oh my gosh, this sounds like me. And there's a great saying in 12-step programs, attraction rather than promotion, and that's very much what Janet Leff was for me. Because she didn't try to preach to me, she didn't try to shove down my throat about all this stuff I needed to do, she just listened. She just listened. She gave me some recovery literature in Croatian, kind of saying, this may be interesting for you to read in the local language so you know what words are used. She had this great Kentucky drawl. And yeah, it was just the relationship she built with me that summer that made me feel I could go to her when I did have an occasion to use drugs again, and I did. And I was also very worried about my mental health at that time. I didn't know what was wrong with me underneath all of this other than I was crazy. And so in August of '01, I went and I talked to her, and I just spent 3 hours with her out in the summer sun under a tree, giving her kind of my whole life story and everything that had happened and why I gravitated to chemicals and why I never just felt comfortable in my own skin. And one of the first things she said to me was, Jamie, the good news here is I believe you're alcoholic. To which I responded, how is that good news? Please enlighten me. And she said, it's good news because we have something we can do about it. And she was one of the first ones who she was the first one who confidently presented this idea to me that addiction is a disease or an illness, and you may not agree with that, but that's my personal belief at this point, and that it can be healed. And so much of what I had been raised with, especially in church, is that, you know, you're just a sinner who needs to shape up. And her approaching it with me as something that could be treated was empowering. It was one of very many strategies she used that summer that truly saved my life. And so I approached this with an attitude of, well, what do I need to do to treat this? Because it was just so verifying and validating to hear that this was not a defect in myself as a person. Also later in that summer, I had a very powerful reaction to a piece of criticism that my boss I was working for at the time had given. And it did tie into an early childhood trauma issue. And my breakdown was so severe over this altercation I had with my boss. Janet literally walked me home, put me to bed, sat at my bedside as I cried through it. And she said, Jamie, this isn't tears, this is post-traumatic, whatever you're going through right now. And it was the first time I had ever heard that word trauma, wound, used to validate so much of what I had experienced in life and growing up. And she said, the good news is there's something we could do to treat this too. And probably the most compelling piece of advice she gave me that summer, after hearing so much of the ins and outs of how I coped with things like bullying, and I'm also a survivor of sexual assault, both childhood and adulthood. And after hearing a lot of the intricacies of my story, she said, Jamie, after everything you have went through, it's no wonder you turned to drugs and alcohol. So what are you going to do about it now? And I'd like you to listen to that advice again, because for me, this is where it's at. This is the creed I operate from as a professional clinician. Because I know there is a concern out there when we talk about raising awareness and raising stigma that, well, aren't we just going to create a bunch of pansies out there and give people all kind of excuses? And I don't think it's ever about that. Because if you treat people with that hard-headed attitude, you're just going to shut them down. And I think many of us in this room have experienced that. But listen very carefully to Janet's advice. After everything you went through, it's no wonder you turned to drugs and alcohol. It's no wonder you became alcoholic. So what now? What are you going to do about it now? Now that you know, what's the plan? And in that advice, that was the most life-saving thing I was ever given. She validated my experience, she validated my trauma, and then she challenged me into action. And I think too often our fatal error is that we challenge people into action without first validating their experience. And that's where you create resistance, and that's where you shut people down. And I am so, so, so grateful that she didn't do that to me. And so a couple of years back, when I wrote one of my books, which is called Trauma and the 12 Steps, somebody asked me, it was a great question, an interviewer asked me, what's your mission for this work? What would you like to have happen as a result of this book? And my simple answer was that anybody who seeks help is met with someone like Janet Leff. And I cry because I know how many people are not. How many people are not. So my call to you as people who work in the community is that we validate, that we honor the struggle. Another amazing, amazing boss I had a chance to work for in my time in treatment over in Trumbull County, Ken Lloyd, would always say, our role in this work is to honor the struggle of the people who come to us. And if we're not doing that, then we're very much missing the point. So from those early days in Bosnia, getting intervened upon by Janet and having a lot of my early counseling and early meetings from her, she sent me back kicking and screaming to graduate school in 2000. I officially got sober in 2002, so this was 2003, I came back to graduate school. And I looked at her like she had 10 heads, because I didn't even like psychology when I was an undergrad. No joke. My degree is in American Studies and History. I have a pop culture degree, basically, and come at this from more of a performing background. And she said, Jamie, I think you're gonna like being a professional counselor, because what you've learned over here in Bosnia is so much of the art of this, how to work with people. And now you need to go back and learn the science of it. And one of the inscriptions she gave me in a book that she gifted me was, Jamie, God doesn't choose the qualified, He qualifies the chosen. And I think of how many of us, and I know a lot of you in this room who work in this field, have done it as a pay it forward from your own recovery, from your own willingness to make a difference. And I continue to honor and salute that, if that applies to you. So here I am, 16 years, 2 divorces later. Because even though you might get sober and get into recovery, life will still happen, and that presents an opportunity to just embrace more of the challenges ahead. Now, a very other significant thing that happened as part of my recovery story is when I began working in the field. I was sober a while, enough, a little over a year, just shy of 2 years. And I found myself working at an adolescent residential treatment center in my clinical residency, clinical internship. And I was being severely triggered by a lot of the people I was working with. Not so much the students and the children themselves, the way I saw the system treating a lot of the students and the children that I was working with. And what often happens, especially when you deal with dual recovery, that as my addiction issues had cleared up and had basically become dormant, a lot of the mental health stuff really began to surface. The depression, the dysthymia, and this condition called dissociation, which we don't talk about enough. In its simplest form, dissociation is zoning out, checking out, kind of drifting off. It is a protective mechanism that the brain can develop very, very, very early in childhood when confronted with extreme stress. And I've dissociated my whole life. It's been a big part of how me, as this very sensitive kid, was able to cope with a lot of the injustice I saw in the world, with a lot of the things that I saw going on around me, as I just kind of zoned out. And there's a lot of stigma specifically around dissociative disorder and dissociative identity disorder. Because if you want a real masterclass in what dissociative disorder is not, watch any of the movies that Hollywood has made on dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personalities. Now, I was formally diagnosed in 2004 when I was 2 years sober. I don't have DID because I don't really blank out time, but I do have several distinct personality states that live within me that developed at very early years and through the different traumatic experiences in my life to help me cope with what was coming up. And immediately, even in my field, one thing that I like to share is I'm out as an addict. I'm out as somebody on the LGBT spectrum, identify as bisexual, but being out as a dissociative woman is so scary. Because people, even in my field, can hear dissociation and think the craziness of multiple personality disorders that you see in the movies. It's really not that dramatic for most of us. That so much of what living with dissociation is about is knowing that we can get very easily overwhelmed in the presence of heavy emotion and heavy affect. And a lot of my own therapy I've had to do over the years, a lot of what my own yoga practice and grounding has helped me to be able to do is to stay grounded so that I don't have to check out and zone out. And nothing is ever as bad as it was at earlier points in my life. In my personal experience, self-injury went along very much with some of my dissociative checkouts, zone-outs that would happen both as a child. Self-injury is another thing I haven't directly addressed until now because there's still a lot of stigma around that, whether it come in the form of cutting, self-mutilation, head banging, and for me it was hurting my head. That was the primary way that a lot of self-injury manifested in childhood and then even in adulthood. Even as a woman in addiction recovery, whenever those symptoms start to flare for me, it's a sign I need to get in and re-engage with a deeper level of counseling and healing. And I want to say very publicly, although I've been a public personality in this field for over a decade, I've been a counselor now for 14, 15 years formally, I'm still in therapy. I haven't necessarily constantly been in therapy, but as conditions have arisen, as life has happened, it's necessitated a need to do deeper work. And I do think if you work in the field, specifically if you work with trauma, it is a bit of an occupational hazard because it will illuminate your shadow stuff, the things inside that may still need help and may still need addressed. So part of having dissociative disorder means I can see multiple perspectives on different things. Because a way to simplify it, all of us dissociate. Even people who identify as normal will check out. Playing on your phone is dissociative if you don't want to be coping with what's going on in the larger life around you. Doing a Netflix binge is dissociative. Even if you do a guided meditation, that's like going to the beach, going to your happy place. It's using this ability to step out of yourself in order to cope. Those of us who have diagnosed dissociative conditions just do it a little more intensely, is really how I describe it. And the other part of dissociation is this idea of parts, the multiple personality, the scary stuff. Okay, we all have parts. How many of you have ever referred to yourself before as having an inner child? Or having like that angry, raging Hulk that pops out? You may all have different roles. Like I act a different way when I'm a father, when I'm a mother, when I'm a professional. For those of us with dissociative disorder, it's just a little more pronounced. But part of what healing can involve is learning how to work with the different interplay of the parts together so that we can look at any situation in life and see creative solutions. I believe so much of my dissociation fuels my creativity, fuels my ability to write, fuels my ability to just be able to do what Janet did for me, which is see where people are coming from. So people ask me all the time, what does healing look like? And Jamie, if you're truly healed, if you're truly this recovery ambassador, why are you standing up there talking about still having dissociative parts? Or why do you still call yourself an alcoholic? And I think it is fundamentally up to us as people in recovery to identify and define what recovery looks like for us. And for me, my conditions are chronic, but that's not a death sentence, that's part of the gift. Because if I didn't have conditions that continue to need to be addressed and healed, I wouldn't be living this life with this willingness to take myself to the next level. I hear a lot of people say things like, I feel cursed that I was born with this, or there's just something so defective about me for being born with this condition. And there were times in both my addiction journey and my mental health journey where I just felt too sensitive for my own good. Like nothing was ever really going to work to bring about healing. And going back to our wound metaphor, some wounds may never truly heal in a go back to the way it should be type of sense. And the physical example I use all the time is think of somebody who was born with one leg. Healing for them will never mean you get your leg back. But healing could mean you use the resources available to you, like prosthetic technology, having a support system, a spiritual frame of reference, good coping, good sense of humor. And I do have a dear friend who's a professional clinician who was born with one leg. And through all the things that I just mentioned, for all intents and purposes, she is a thriver. She is more functional than so many of us I know with two legs, being able to do what she does. And many people with chronic physical illness are able to thrive through using the resources that are made available to them. Now, part of the political social commentary on that is we have to be fierce advocates for helping people access the resources they need and be shown how to use them, not just pick yourself up by the bootstraps. Because too often when that is said, it is said to people who don't have boots, who don't have straps, metaphorically speaking, sometimes actually speaking, and aren't shown how to pick themselves up. Because unpacking that metaphor a bit, I do think there is an element to recovery of learning how to pick yourself up, to get back up on the swing. If you watch my TED Talk, there's a story I mentioned in there about a little girl in Bosnia who literally taught me everything I needed to know about overcoming fear by getting back up on a swing as soon as she fell off of it. And she was able to do that because she had some own internal gumption and those of us around to support her. So there is an element of recovery that does involve learning how to pick yourself up, but that's the key, learning. Providing others with the help that they need to be able to use these resources to, in fact, pick themselves up. So, recovery is possible. I'm so glad to see that on the cornhole board. And just thank you all very, very much for being here today. Your commitment to show up, to me, shows that you're on the front lines of this battle that we're in to validate mental health care as health care. And as both a professional and as someone in personal recovery from several conditions that I talked about, recovery is possible, thriving is possible. And just one more story, and then I'll turn it back over to Jack to evidence why we need events like Stamp Out Stigma. There are people in my field, there are other writers, there are other people I work with who can still get very uncomfortable when somebody of my level gets up here and talks about personal recovery. And that's a problem. Because for those of us who work in this field, there is an art to not making it all about us when we work with people, and I'm not saying do that, but I do believe there has to be a wider conversation to speak candidly, to speak openly about that some of the best people who work in this field are those of us who are survivors of this stuff and have lived to tell the tale and want to do our small part to pay it forward. Thank you so much. Thanks to Jack and Tony and Fern for the invitation, and I'll turn it back over to you. Oh, quick plug. Tonight, 7 o'clock, the evening event. If some of you are nearby, you're certainly welcome to come back, or if you want to share with others. I'll be telling a little bit of my personal story tonight, but the focus tonight will be a little different. It'll mostly be on using mindfulness strategies in healing and recovery. So mindfulness is a meditation approach, very ancient in its origins, that provides us with so much of what we need to be able to ride the wave of emotional upheaval, and especially done in concert with many approved treatments and treatments that are well established in the field, can certainly be very helpful. I also wanted to give a plug over to my table. I have these 3x3 cards. Feel free to take them. Take as many as you like. If you want to take a few for your offices or others you work with. And if you want more, sign up on my mailing list. Talk to me after the talk. We can get you more. I do keep a resources website, traumamadesimple.com, that is completely free for people to access. You can look at it up here. traumamadesimple.com. It's the site connected to 2 of my books. Literally anything free I have done is up on this website. A lot of articles, a lot of blogs that can be purchased free of charge if you can't afford the books. And I know my YouTube presence has been mentioned. I have no shortage of mindfulness skills, yoga-based skills, other recovery talks I've given that people can access on YouTube. So I have them all cataloged on this website at traumamadesimple.com. Please feel free to use it to spread the word. I put it up there just as another small extension of my desire to make wider resources and wider conversations available. So thank you very much, and Jack, I'll give you the mic back.